Welcome back to the Impact Driven Leader podcast. This is your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. Man, I'm excited to be here, excited that you're listening. So energized by this conversation I just had. I'm doing the intro. I'm wrapping up from that conversation with Gustavo Razzetti. Gustavo is the author of Remote, Not Distant. You're going to see that later on in the video. If you're watching the video as well, he is the leader, CEO of Fearless Culture, a consultant organization that helps organizations with culture. And man, we dig in and have a great conversation, a little bit about this remote, not distant, but more about the evolution that we're seeing today in leadership. It's something, if you are a regular listener of the Impact Driven Leader podcast, if you watch some of my videos, some of my content, that I talk a lot about it. We're going through this, as with many guests, as Gustavo did, I said, hey, who's listening? It's like, well, the person that I aim this podcast to be for is someone who, much like myself, we found ourselves at a point where, what does leadership look like? What does it look like to lead in our current environment? I can't do what I used to do and expect new results. COVID has caused that. Gustavo and I talk a lot about that subject. And it's a fun conversation that, again, we talk about remote work, but we talk about so much more in the evolution of workers. And here's a thought I'm going to leave you with. I bring this up in our conversation. I want to tease it now. You're going to hear it later. Can we make old dogs learn new tricks? Or maybe here's another way. Can we make new dogs do what old dogs do? Think about that. Let that sit in the back of your mind as you listen to the conversation. I'll tie it up at the end. Again, thanks for being here. If you're not a subscriber, hit subscribe, whether on YouTube or wherever you listen to this, so that way you're updated whenever there's a new episode. And as well, one last thing, if you get value at all at any point during today, let Gustavo know, share it with someone else, increase your learning by sharing it, have a conversation with people. That's something that I love to do, and I encourage you to do as well. I'll catch you in the end, wrap all this up. Again, Gustavo Razzetti. Gustavo, good morning, and I am so excited to have this conversation. One, in preparation, but two, just meeting another person who has many of the same ideals and ideologies in regard to leadership and people and serving. It's a kindred spirit that I believe we have, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Awesome. Good morning, Tyler, and thank you for having me. Also, good morning to everyone who's joining. At least watching the recording, great to be here. I'm very excited and see how, even though we share things, we can share different perspectives and complement our views.
So you, as we can see in the background for those watching the video, last year wrote the book Remote, Not Distant, talking about workplaces. And to me, it was probably a little bit in the moment, but very ahead of the moment for everything that we've seen the last 12 to 24, now 36 months of this whole idea of remote work, hybrid work, get back in the office because you have to be in the office. So I'd love for you to kind of just help the audience, help myself understand, how did you get to that place and realize, oh, we have problems?
Well, for me, I think that if we zoom out, I think that we have problems long before the pandemic. I always like to say that the pandemic didn't hurt organization, but actually amplified both the good and the bad. And there were really, most organizations thrive in the pandemic. There was a lot of adjustment, but many organizations were ready to adapt. Many others weren't. So when now we hear that working either remotely or in a hybrid spectrum, whatever the spectrum is, it's harming culture. Actually, I say, well, your culture wasn't in good shape before that. Yeah. And if you see a lot of indicators like Gallup engagement surveys, they were really, really, really bad before the pandemic. So I think that what the pandemic helped us is realize that culture really matters. And most importantly, that we cannot continue doing business as usual. And people are looking for different things. And we're going to expand on that. Which things are people looking when it comes to their workplace?
I think you bring a point there. And if you look at economically, pre-pandemic, the economy was on such a rise, on such a high, and that success to me masked all the bad culture, that organizations had. And you saw as we entered into the pandemic, and that really changed so many workplaces, either people rose to the moment or they absolutely, went down. And we've seen that from organizations. There's a place that I want to jump here to that I think really kind of helps divide those two different, to me, it's a dichotomy. The companies that succeeded through the last couple of years and almost got better, and the companies that have struggled and just there's all this tension. And it's on page 42 of your book, and it talks about let go of control, be a facilitator. And to me, that's the difference. That's the difference if we talk about the leader who embraces remote work compared to the leader who really struggles with it. Are they willing to let go of control and realize it's going to be different going forward? Talk a little bit more about how you see that.
Absolutely. I think that we need to think about the leadership narrative, and not in the workplace, but in history throughout centuries.
Yeah.
I always use this Mel Gibson Braveheart movie, in which he's the one that goes first and kills 20% of the army and then people follow. I think that narrative, not only it's broken, but actually was never real. So leaders don't do things on their own. Leaders are not heroes. Good leaders are not miracle performers. They're great at building the right culture. So they facilitate what needs to happen, because in the end, where you, like Steve Jobs famously says, so you're hiring the best talent, so let them do their work. And I think that's the point about being a facilitator. So a few months ago, one of the CEO actually from Google asked a question, who was, to your employees, what are the speed bumps that are getting in your way to do better work, move faster, innovate? And I think that when it comes to facilitator, it's not about making things easier for your team, but basically remove unnecessary pain. I mean, work is not easy. The world is not easy, but leaders need to create the right context and the right content for people to do their job. And that's for me the biggest shift. Rather than trying to have all the answers, good leaders need to lead with great questions. Let people think, think, challenge your team, but then let them come out with the best solutions.
So where do you think that ideology of, the image of the Mel Gibson, I love that kind of the overbearing, the, extreme, masculine personality that's believed, that's what a leader looks like. In reality, we know in great, societies that hasn't been the leader who actually gets the most of people. I think as I'm saying that, I remember I saw a Jane Goodall, article, and she talked about her study of gorillas and chimpanzees, and she said the overbearing dominant leaders, they led, but not as long as the empathetic, the caring, the really supportive leaders within that community. And we see that same thing in humans, and it's like, where did we get that idea of that's what good leadership looks like? Or why do we fall into that pattern?
I think there are two patterns. One is historic, So I think that anything when it comes to leadership narrative, from books, from movies, from the news, etc., that's what happens. So I think that when, for example, you read any leadership book about the success of a company, it's always written by the CEO. Actually, not written by them; it's signed by them, but someone like a ghost writer did it. And they make it all about that person. No, you're running a 100,000 employee company. You cannot tell me that one person is actually making all decisions, inventing all the products, and so on and so forth. One example I like to use I put in my book, actually, I think it's about when Steve Jobs was presented for the first time with the idea of Apple creating its own phone, now the iPhone, which is the most profitable product in the company's history. He actually rejected it. He said, no way, a phone company suck. Apple would never become that. So he resisted over and over. So that's the heroic leader that thinks that they have all the answers. Luckily, Apple's culture of innovation was stronger, and they were able to push back, and they were able to show him, hey, we're not here to mimic what other companies do. We're here to create Apple's version of what a phone should be. And the rest is history. So I think that to your point, a lot of research about leadership sees that we admire people who are good at selling themselves, who are very persuasive, they know how to talk, they are very dominant in their personality. But in the end, research shows that the most effective leaders tend to be more introverted, they tend to be more team players, they are not about themselves, and maybe they're very bad about selling themselves, but they're actually much better at making decisions and building strong teams.
So as you and I talked about before we got started, and the audience that I aim to serve and bring guests to talk to is that Gen X millennial leader that's now the bridge between the older generation and now the younger generations, the millennials, the Gen Zs, who want something totally different than what organizations have presented in the past. As I've read in books, and as I believe that you kind of point to, a generation now of workers that want to be understood and not just show up to work and be glad you have a job. That seemed like for generations, that's what it was. So how do we move people to that point to where they feel empowered to lead in that way?
Absolutely. I would say that, once again, I don't think that when we talk about generations, things are an evolution. So it's not that all of a sudden people now change. I think the change has been happening. People looking for meaningful work, to collaborate, to be understood, to be more human, to care about the environment, not just the work. But the leaders in charge were not letting those people do that. So if you say, hey, this is not good for the environment, you could get either ignored, laughed at, or maybe fired. Mm-hmm. Now companies, some out of pressure, some out of conviction, or maybe reflecting on their behavior, they're realizing that, hey, we need to care about more. So I think that leaders that are coming from these new generations have a huge opportunity to change things a lot. It's not going to be easy. And I think my advice would be that sometimes when you're too idealistic, then you get frustrated very quickly. So my advice is don't stop being idealistic, don't stop fighting, but realize that the only way that you can make change is from within. So quitting all the time and going somewhere else, or having a one-person company, I mean, do it if that's the way to go, but the amount of change they're going to be doing, it's really small in terms of scale. Yeah. When you're able to influence larger systems, then the impact of your work as a leader is going to be larger.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about probably in your experience, how you saw, the organizations you've worked with or the different leaders that you've worked with, how you saw maybe that evolution play out. And we're seeing that again. And to me, it's a very entrepreneurial mindset, meaning we have this entrepreneurial mindset as a culture and people want to embrace it. And how do we allow that mindset to work within corporations instead of saying you can't act like that here?
Definitely. I think that you mentioned mindset. I think that many companies use the term mindset like a magic thing, I metaphorically, mindset is the lens used to filter reality, right?
Yeah.
But it's not as easy as putting up a different pair of lenses and now, hey, everything's going to change. And I think that changing the mindset also requires changing the system. So I have a lot of leaders, CEOs from mid-sized, large companies that say, hey, Gustavo and your team, can you help me build a culture of innovation? And I say, well, let's talk about mistakes, right? How do you deal with the mistakes? And the realization is that most companies are mistake intolerant. Mm. The same way somebody rejects lactose and we are lactose intolerant, some companies reject mistakes. And I'm not talking about errors on your day-to-day jobs that you should be doing without thinking. I'm talking about if you're expecting people to learn how to incorporate AI into their work, if you're expecting people to come up with new formulas, new software, whatever, they're going to screw up. No one gets it right the first time, not even the second. So if leaders don't create a culture in which mistakes are welcome, mistakes are addressed in the open, and we learn from those, then how you could invite people to do that? And I think that many people are frustrated because they hear this kind of inconsistency. One thing is what leaders promote, but then what they reward or punish with their behaviors is completely the opposite.
That to me is you hit on such a point. It's the leader that embraces mistakes and learns from those mistakes and allows those mistakes to lead innovation is a leader who actually builds trust within an organization, right? Without trust, without the ability to say, hey, all right, I screwed up. Great. Let's own it. What can we learn from it? Instead of thinking, you made a mistake. Now I'm so fearful of a mistake because I'm going to get fired, or I'm so fearful of a mistake because now I'm going to lose the autonomy or the appreciation of my superior. So much of it, I think, in those is around trust, but it's around the personal security of the leader. If they're comfortable in their position, they're going to be more comfortable with people making mistakes. If they're not comfortable in their position, they're going to be tense. And the mistakes they're, ultimately going to look at is, is this going to affect me? If it affects me, I can't allow mistakes.
Absolutely. And I think that we are transitioning the leadership style, going back to the origin of the beginning of our conversation. And one thing that's happening is that many leaders are realizing that the model that took them where they are is not going to help the organization go into the future. However, they're having a hard time. Like their brain realizes it needs to be different, but then their managers or their managers' managers are not there, no? And they don't want to push back. And my point is, if you're a leader and you're not willing to fight for what you think you're right, then quit. No, so being a leader is not. I think that going back to the narrative, many people feel that being a leader is okay. I made it to the top. Now I have all the privileges. It's going to be easier, and now let the other people take the risk. And it's not that like that. It's the contrary. Basically, the more you climb into the ladder, the more risks you're going, the more vulnerable you need to be. So you need to model that behavior. If you want to, I remember working with a company recently where we're mapping their culture, and they say, no, we really promote innovation. And then at some point, talking to different groups in the organization, we realized that, hey, no, you reward innovation that works. So the innovation that fails, those experiments, you hide them. So it's easy to reward what goes right, but what about the rest?
Yeah. Well, and I think the great scientists, the great innovators of time say the innovations that work are not the ones to study. It's the ones that don't work, the ones to figure out why didn't it work, because we thought it was going to. So let's understand why it didn't work. That leads us to the next great innovation, and not, it worked today, we know all the answers. It doesn't really happen. I want to go back because it's probably going to take a few minutes here for us to unpack it, but you make this mention of this massive cultural and business evolution that I think we're experiencing. It's, the style of leadership is changing. The workplace dynamics, how people are working, where they're working is changing. And yet so many leaders listening in are in the midst of that, in the midst of layoffs, in the midst of all this, transition. And they're sitting here saying, how do I lead the people I lead? And yet I'm forced to answer to those that want to hold on to the style of business that was done pre-pandemic, because they're sitting here saying, we have to get back to what brought us to success. Like you said, but I would agree with you. That will never happen. There will never be the normal of the past. So how does that leader, how do you, what do you say to that leader to empower them to say, keep doing what's right for the people?
I think that if you don't do what's right for the people, then people are not going to give you the best work that they can. So when we say focus on people, it's not about being overly protective or about, it's not about the people. It's like, hey, people is what drives your business. And if you really want your business to grow, you need to trust your people. For me, the most important thing is that many employees, when they had no chance but to, for example, start working remotely in the beginning of the pandemic, without training, without technology, without the expertise, with the additional stress of a global pandemic and no one knew what was happening, they adapted. It took some time, it was stressful, but in the end, most organizations stood afloat. So, most businesses were able to make it, and many actually grew during the pandemic. They became even more profitable, etc. Research shows that people, when they work remotely, they feel more psychologically safe, they are more productive, and so on and so forth. And actually, they're working more hours because the time that people save commuting, some part goes to personal life, which is good, taking care of themselves, but also there's some extra time that goes to actually doing work. So net, there's a lot of benefits in which companies are improving. So why do they want to do that? It's a kind of first, because many people are doing it, so it becomes an excuse. But most importantly, many leaders, especially senior white men, old, are basically going back to what's comfortable for them.
Yes.
The way they used to be trained, the ways they operate. So the question for me is not where do we work from, how do we work, but it's how can we create an environment that allows people to do their best work? And flexibility is critical. There's a lot of clear examples. For example, Spotify, Allstate, Airbnb, all companies that have accelerated dramatically the amount of women in executive positions. So now Spotify across the world has more than 45% of their executive positions that are women. Allstate dramatically increased diversity, same with Airbnb, and all those companies are over-delivering in results. So flexibility, it's great to change your culture and get a lot of people, diverse thinking, to do better work.
One thought that always hits me when I get in this conversation, and much like yourself, you're writing this remote, not distance. There's some inherent things that need to be replaced there. The coffee pot talk, the water cooler talk, the I'm walking by you to the restroom, and there's that interaction that you have to almost create now if you're in a remote situation, but yet relying on that as the way to do business is not effective. And again, it goes back to an old style where everyone was in the office and that's the only way you had to interact. But I want to kind of overlay a subject with that. If we look at most college graduates today, and college graduates over the last probably 8 to 10 years, most of them did not step into a classroom that are last 2 or 3 years of school. Most of their work was online, remote. It was doing classwork online. And so when I think about that, I look at the leader that's saying, hey, I just hired you, Gustavo. You just graduated from university. Great. Now you're going to come show up at my office and you're going to do work. And I think about that person and they're like, well, this is not normal to me. I did not work like this the last couple of years to graduate from university. Instead, I did everything remote, because that's what worked for the university. So now you want me to work in a system that's not natural to me. And what I find when I have those conversations discussed with people, that's almost like we never thought about it like that. We never even realized that we've conditioned workers, we've educated people. For my own kids who are teenagers now, who do so much work online, so much work remote by themselves, and we're creating a worker who then, when we hire them, we're saying, well, that doesn't work for us. How much do you see of that? Are organizations recognizing that, or is that a very slow recognition?
I would say the latter is a very small recognition. But once again, I think we need to go back to challenging our mental frameworks. To your point, I have teenagers, I'm 55, different experience, but their experience is all their first relationship with their basically girlfriends started online. They didn't start dating we met casually. And so for them and for us would be, well, but how do you know? Whatever. And that's how they used to be. I think that the most important thing is we need to stop seeing things like in black or white terms. So when we talk about hybrid, people feel, either people work remotely or they need to back to the office. And that's not the point. It's about how can we integrate the best of both worlds. Yeah. You talk about the water cooler conversations, and I don't want to be the party pooper here, but there's no research, and I did a lot of work. I took a lot of experts writing my book. There's no piece of research that shows that those impromptu conversations actually create any kind of creativity or innovation. It might in isolated pockets. Yeah. What there's a lot of research is those conversations were exclusive. There were people after the meeting talking about things, talking about their colleagues behind their back, or saying the things that everyone should hear in a meeting, but they weren't because they were afraid. Yeah. Right. So what we need to do now is how can we earn people commute? How can we make it worthy for people to go back to the office? But most importantly, why and when should go people back to the office? For example, the 3 and 2 or 4 and 1 kind of day arrangements, they are useless because they are, once again, trying to recreate a rigid schedule rather than think of what type of work is my team doing in the next week, 2 weeks, 1 month. And based on that, sometimes maybe they need to get 2 weeks in a row together in a room to crack some big challenge together, but maybe for a month, they don't need to see each other. On their hands, even companies that work fully remote, they still see each other.
Yeah.
But when they see, it's about having dinner. They spend a lot of time building relationships. So if you're going to bring people to the office, a lot of that time should be to create relationships. If I'm going to go to a desk and try to write a presentation when I have people like 2 feet away from me, they're all screaming, taking phone calls, that's not effective. I'm not going to build relationships. I'm going to fail to do my deep work. So it's the work that should define the working schedule and not a schedule, whatever that is, define how people work.
You know, as you share that, I think about, instances where I've worked with, different tech providers, and they do 3-week sprints. And I think about that as kind of like, oh, if we look at that what's the work that we need to accomplish the next month? Where are days that would be imperative? Hey, you know what? If we sat down, we brainstorm together, let's do that in person. Let's take that time to have a meal. Let's interact. But then we go 2.5 weeks, we go do our deep work, and then we come back at the end of the, that sprint or whatever it may be, that work cycle, projects that we're working on. Hey, let's have that time together. I think that's such an excellent example, but yet it means you have to look at that work and leadership in an innovative way instead of, well, here's the blueprint that's always worked, so we have to find a way for that blueprint to fit everything going forward.
Definitely. I think also the office itself, the blueprint needs to change, but also the blueprint of the physical space. I think that the model of the open office, it was created for companies to save money, so to have more people in fewer space. It was sold to us, and I bought into, it's going to drive collaboration, blah, blah, but in the end, it didn't work. So if we're going to have people in the office, we also need to rethink how the office is designed. So we need to have spaces that are clearly for building relationships, socializing. We need to have spaces where are important for people to do deep work. Having a phone booth where people can take a call, standing up for an hour, it's not necessarily a solution, but also if people need to write something or do some research, standing on a phone booth, it's not going to help.
Yeah.
And lastly, we need to be more mindful about collaboration spaces. Having conference rooms with a long table and people sitting in front of each other, it's not better than being, and like we are now on a Zoom call, or in this case, Riverside, looking at each other. So we need to be more creative about how we design that space.
The piece that I am again coming back to here is as we recreate that, it needs to be done new. And I almost think about that as I think about my, friends and peers that are dealing with, much of what we're discussing here, this evolution in leadership, but it's evolution in the workplace and understanding if I had somebody that was hired pre-pandemic, because I'm going to use that as a very defining mark. It isn't absolute, but it is in our society. If I had someone that was hired pre-pandemic, they were coming to an office 5 days a week, they were doing good work. And then all of a sudden, here now, 2 years later, I'm starting to look at it and say, this isn't working. What I need to understand is it's not that we have a problem in their ability to work. They're not the right person. I need to find someone who thrives in working in an office that does not like to work remote, there are people that say, I do not work well at home. I do not work well, in that instance, I work much better going to an office, being able to get there at 8 a.m., leave at 5, have my lunch break. That works for me. We need to hire that person rather than trying to force the person that has grown and evolved to go back to what they used to be. I'm a person of faith, and I think about this, and it's an example, and you can't put new wine in old wineskins. And I believe that's exactly what's happening. We're trying to put new wine into old wineskins. and we're trying to make it work, and it's just not working.
Yeah, definitely. I think once again, you brought a very interesting point, which is, first of all, we need to stop thinking in one-size-fits-all approaches.
Yeah.
From a company standpoint, because each team requires different arrangements. I know it's more complicated, but many companies have been able to crack that code once you let go, going back to what we were talking before about letting go. But also when it comes to people, to individuals, there are some people, regardless of age, that might need to go to the office. Maybe they don't have the right physical space at home to work from. Maybe they love the experience of being in a nice building with nice people, hopefully. And also maybe they don't have good relationships at home, so they don't want to be there. So going to the office, it's escape, if you will. Also, some younger people in different roles, they want to be close to people so they can learn from observation.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to identify how can we create a flexible model in which people can define how they work. Of course, there need to be certain team agreements. We need to find some common ground, but also flexibility for people to work around that system.
I think about great sport coaches, and they, there's this ideology that, every player needs to be treated the same. In reality, great coaches realize, no, every player is treated differently based upon what brings out the best in that player. And I think that moves into our corporate teams as well. And it's embracing to say, okay, instead of Gustavo, you have 50 people to lead. And therefore, the easiest way to do that, instead of trying to lead 50 people differently, you just put a blanket, this is going to be the protocol. Instead saying, hey, we can't do that because that doesn't yield the best results, but that's a difficult charge for you to be able to lead everyone how they need to be led. We need to actually different team leaders to say, hey, what's important here? I think there's a point where maybe that's needed in order that people can be cared for better, instead of just saying, hey, the blanket approach and the very thin organization is going to yield results. Instead, no, we need a better relationship of understanding who works well in different positions, who doesn't, and allow for that, rather than thinking, hey, let's just full steam ahead, Elon Musk, everyone has to be in the office, everyone has to work this way. You're either going to have people in the organization, that's what they want, or you're going to have everyone leave.
Exactly. And you mentioned that character, but once again, what are the media talking about? Elon Musk being the bravado, the hero, the guy says, I said, this is my way because I'm the leader and people need to obey. But then there was a picture and was a real case of a couple who had a newborn, and they were both the employee with his wife and the newborn sleeping at Twitter's office. So is that the kind of culture do you want? That's the message. Is that the kind of workplace that you want as an employee? I don't think so. We are people that care about people, right? So, but then, as I mentioned earlier, there are companies, because they offer flexibility, that they were able to dramatically increase the amount of the diversity, having more women raising to senior positions. So I think that's what companies have been promoting and talking about. But now there's real evidence that shows that flexibility in the workplace is going to help you achieve that. And I think that the people that have the opportunity to do that because of flexibility, they're going to do not only their best, they're going to go the extra mile to help you because you're offering that opportunity.
Yeah. There's that piece of getting people to go the extra mile means that they have a reason to go that extra mile. And to me, that comes down from understanding and having the belief and having that alignment, which is something that you talk a lot about, is finding that alignment. To me, there's work that needs to be done. And the more that leaders push that work down on other people, doesn't mean it's going to get done. It's going to cause more frustration. The leader needs to do the work and say, hey, how do we need to change the way that we lead ourselves? Where do I need to grow as a leader in order that I can serve people in a better way? It's going to look different, and I need to grow and change. I need to become more vulnerable and comfortable where I'm not uncomfortable, where I'm comfortable, in order that I can serve people better. That's the work that needs to be done instead of saying, well, I'm not going to do the work. I'm going to force it on other people to align. And what ends up happening is this major frustration that we see every day in organizations, really kind of magnified because it's all coming to a head. It's all, kind of at the forefront.
Absolutely. And we basically move back into culture. So hybrid remote is a piece of it, but there are other elements of culture that needs to be taken care of. It's what do you really care about? When I talk to many companies before either we choose if we're going to work together or not, we say, well, what matters the most to you? And most people immediately say people. Of course, we're people first. And I say, what about your customers? What about your stakeholders? What about innovation? I say, well, we are also innovation first, and we are customer first, and we are stakeholder first. And I say, well, you cannot be first everything, right? In life. So that shows that what people say, what leaders say versus what they actually prioritize when they make decisions, actually, it's not consistent. We run a 3-year studio, like asking people, thousands of people across the world, what makes the best or the worst, or what describes the best and the worst culture you ever work out. And that inconsistency between what leaders say and what they actually do is one of the most important points. Now in tech, we're seeing lots of layoffs that are in many cases unfounded. Yeah, can you save money? Of course, but if you want people to innovate, you don't just keep the people that are running the day-to-day show. You need people to have free time to do that. No? But so that's for me the most important thing. Like, leaders are really inconsistent. And I think going back to, if you want to be a leader, it's not about the title. You have to earn that respect. You have to earn that trust. And you need to earn the ability for people to align. So people are not going to align because you force them to align. You need to bring something that's worth aligning around.
Absolutely. As we're getting to a point here to wrap up and put a bow on this, I think that last piece that you talk about, and I love the idea of, as we go through layoffs and we expect people to do more with less, you talk about it and you call it the psychological safety ladder. And the innovation is at the top, meaning in my mind, as I read that, innovation comes by, the desperation at times, but that's only when you're safe to know that I can make a mistake and I'm still going to be able to recover, move forward. I'm not going to innovate if I think that's going to lead me to, demise, right? I'm going to, if I try to innovate and it's wrong, going back to your conversation about, the topic about mistakes, I'm not going to be able to move forward. And this idea of psychological safety, that's what needs to happen in organizations. And what we've talked about this entire segment has been moving towards that safety, bringing about that innovation, and not trying to do it one size fits all, but what works best for us as an organization to get where we want to go.
Absolutely. I think you nailed it. I don't have much to add, but I think it's if we don't build that as a leader, if we don't, going back to the facilitator, you need to facilitate a culture in which people feel that they belong, they're welcome as a person. You need to create a culture in which you facilitate courageous conversations. And what you said before, you need to model that. And lastly, a culture in which it's okay to fail while you're trying to do things for the first time. I'm not talking about failing doing that. We don't want our CPA failing like with the balance sheet, right?
I mean, it's failing in the right way, failing forward, as it's said. It's not failing because of lack. It's failing because we're trying and embracing that. Gustavo,
absolutely.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Love the book. Love what you're about. Love this interaction. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning, very much of a kindred spirit of seeing this evolution right in front of us and trying to make an impact, make a difference. And I thank you for what you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tyler. And thank you, Ram, for joining us. It was a great conversation, and hopefully we can continue it offline.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Gustavo. In the introduction, I made the comment about, an old dog doing new tricks or a new dog doing old tricks. And that was really a allusion to the idea of putting new wine in old wineskins. Again, it's a biblical reference. It's made a comment meaning that you can't take and put new and old because it's not going to be flexible and move. If you think about I don't know much about wineskins, but I know this, that when it's new and you put in new wine, it flexes, it ferments, it does those things. And then once it gets old, it gets dried out, and you try to put in something new. And when that new wine ferments and expands, it blows up the wineskin. And that's what's going on. I'm thankful that that image hit me in this conversation with Gustavo. And as we talked about that, that's what's happening so much for leaders today. We're seeing this right now in front of us, this change of the guard. Gustavo talked about it. These old leaders that want to force back in the way it used to be. Why? Because it's easy. It's easy to go grab that old wineskin and put in the new wine. It's difficult to go find and fashion and buy a new wineskin. It's difficult to find a new way that serves people. And that's the journey we're on. That's the journey that I believe that I'm helping to grow with people. And to become an impact-driven leader is to find the ways new that we can make an impact, to serve people in a different way. Why? Because people deserve to be served differently. We have different technology. As I mentioned during that podcast conversation, is that so many workers today have been educated differently. We figured out different ways, and we can't expect people that have not worked and been conditioned to work in a certain way to embrace and want to learn differently and work differently, especially when they have the opportunity to work remote. There's so many different businesses, whether it's entrepreneurial or other facets, that allow people to work from home, to work in their schedule, to work that, gig type job. And if we're saying that doesn't work for us, then we have to accept we're only going to find people that want to work like that. And that means as leaders, we're going to have to grow. This is an offer that I want to make to you. I just wrapped up the Awaken the Leader Within workshop. Don't worry, there's going to be another one. Go to theimpactdrivenleader.com to be able to sign up and make sure that you can get notified for the next one as well. Share this, a little bit of a tease I have coming up in the next month. I'm going to do a special workshop just for team leaders, for those executives, for those HR directors that Gustavo and I talked about that are stuck here and say, hey, how do I do this? We're going to talk actually a lot about the remote, not distant, the material that Gustavo showed. Why? Because it aligns perfectly with this idea that in order for leaders and organizations to get the most out of people, they need to be trust makers instead of trust breakers. Look for the link to that workshop, the impact workshop, in the notes. In the show notes, you can have a link to that. Would love to be able to serve you in that way. Again, have that conversation to what it looks like for organizations to work through this process of being impact driven, having trust as a driver, being a trust maker instead of a trust breaker. Thanks again for being here. Till next time, have a good one.